Man notices a girl in the window calling to him every day and decides to check her house. A man notices a little girl waving at him from a mysterious house where no one's supposed to be living and decides to find out who she is. Tim Jenkins had one of the most unappreciated and necessary jobs in the world. He took away the garbage. Every morning long before dawn, him and his colleague would drive around the town and take away the refuse the inhabitants had collected the previous day. No one ever saw them, or at least no one except for one little girl. Every morning, Tim would get off the garbage truck in front of one particular house, and there was always a little girl at the window tapping on the glass to get his attention. As soon as the girl saw that Tim looked up, she waved excitedly and mouthed something he couldn't make out. Tim would wave back and mouth good morning, and the girl would give him a big smile and look happy. This would happen every single day, and even though the girl and her family seemed to be living in the house, their garbage bins were always empty, and Tim noticed that the newspapers were piling up on the front porch. In fact, as the days went by, the house started to look unkempt and abandoned. The only sign of life was the little girl waving from the window every morning before dawn. Tim started to worry about the little girl, so one afternoon after he was off work, he decided to drive around the neighborhood and investigate. He walked up to the door of the little girl's house and rang the doorbell. Tim rang and knocked, and he waited patiently, but there was no answer. He thought that maybe the little girl was at school and her mom was at work, but something just didn't feel right. The house next door was very pretty, with a well-kept lawn and roses blooming around the white picket fence. There were no weeds and no newspapers on the porch. So Tim walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell. A little while later, he heard the sound of footsteps and a pretty woman opened the door. "How may I help you?" she asked. Tim was suddenly nervous. He took off his baseball cap and said, "Good afternoon, ma'am. Sorry to bother you. I work at the garbage disposal unit that works this street." "Oh," the woman said, "you do a wonderful job, thank you." "It's mighty nice to hear you say that, ma'am," Tim grinned, "but the reason I'm here is a little strange. Every morning when I do my rounds, and this is before dawn, there's a little girl at the window of the house next door. She's mighty friendly and always waves, but I have a feeling something's not quite right, and just now no one answered the door." The woman frowned. "Next door? There's no little girl next door. In fact, I think the family moved away more than a week ago." Tim shook his head. "That can't be. I saw the little girl this morning." Tim walked away from the house, but he couldn't stop thinking about the little girl. When he saw her waving from the window the next morning, he decided to take action. He called the police and asked them to do a wellness check at the house. Tim explained that he'd seen a little girl in an address where no one was supposed to be living. That day, 2 officers visited the house, and when they heard no response, they forced the door open. The whole house was empty and still. Then they heard a scurrying sound in the kitchen. There was a little girl hidden in the pantry staring at them with wide eyes. The officers explained that they were policemen and they were there to help her, but the little girl just shook her head. One of the officers said, "A man who drives by in the garbage truck every morning told us you were here." When she heard that, the little girl smiled and waved her hands shyly. She moved her lips saying good morning, but no sound came out. The officers realized that the little girl was mute. They also saw there was no food in the house except for a packet of stale crackers. The child had been abandoned. They immediately called child services, and one of the officers gave Tim a call to let him know they'd found the little girl and she was now safe. A quick investigation revealed that the child's father had passed away a few months before. She'd been left in the care of the stepmother, who simply packed her bags and left the child behind. The police issued a warrant for the arrest of the stepmother for abandonment and child endangerment. That night, Tim told his wife all about the little girl. His name was Mia and she was 6 years old. Tim's wife looked at him and said, "Tim, our boys are grown and gone, but I always wanted a daughter." Tim and his wife applied to be Mia's foster parents, and 2 years later they adopted her. It just goes to show that you never know where you're gonna find a family.